Gonzaga secured that first quad one victory on Saturday. Does that mean it is time to put them back in the top 25? The AP poll doesn't think so, but are they right?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Folks, right now, new customers who join today, you'll get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more is a win. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, the Gonzaga women did just fine without Yvonne Ejim last week. We're going to touch on that. We're also going to talk about an NBA trade that sent Canada basketball legend Kelly Olynyk back to his home area of Toronto. We'll get to all of that. But first, we're going to talk back about the AP poll here. The Gonzaga Bulldogs received 50 votes for the AP Top 25 this week. The last couple of weeks, they've been getting 3, 4, 5, barely getting any consideration for the AP Top 25. Of course, they didn't really deserve the consideration at that time, but now, after picking up their first quad one win of the year, after picking up their first marquee road victory of the year, after picking up a victory over a ranked team in the Kentucky Wildcats, who are number 17 at the time of the game on Saturday, the Zags are starting to get back into that top 25 conversation. There were 7 schools that did not make the top 25 that had more votes than Gonzaga. That means Gonzaga's technically 33rd if you want to count how the AP voters work, how it ranks. I don't know if it really matters outside of the top 25, but technically that would put Gonzaga at 33rd. And you may be thinking, well, you know, Gonzaga's only 1-5 in those quad one games. They don't deserve to be in this conversation. And you might be right, but KenPom has Gonzaga as the 19th best team in the country, 23rd best offensively, 34th best defensively, according to their adjusted offensive and adjusted defensive efficiencies. And no, you should not be using KenPom exclusively when making decisions about who to vote for in the AP Top 25. I do a Top 25 every single week for Locked On College Basketball, and KenPom is a very valuable tool, as is the net, as are win-loss records, recent games, margin of victory, various other things. But when a team is in the top 20 in KenPom, you certainly have to give them extra consideration. And it's not like the net doesn't like them either. Net has them 24th. That would still be in the top 25, if my math is correct there. Of course, Gonzaga is still only 1-5 in those quad one games. The win coming over Kentucky on Saturday. The losses remain Purdue, UW, UConn, San Diego State, and St. Mary's. Outside of that, Gonzaga is 3-1 in quad 2 games and a combined 14-0 in quad 3 and 4. 2-1 in quad 2 games. This is an unfortunate situation that has developed for Gonzaga, as the USC game no longer a quad 2 game. That is a quad 3 victory for Gonzaga. UCLA and USC, as a matter of fact, are both quad 3 wins for Gonzaga. That's just unfortunate. Not a whole lot you can do about that. Gonzaga didn't pick to play UCLA in the Maui Invitational. They were considered one of the, a premier program at the beginning of the year. We kind of knew that their season might go a little bit astray, but nobody expected this. For USC, they were a top 25 team coming into the season. I think they were top 20 at a lot of media outlets, and here they are. Now it's a quad 3 neutral site victory for Gonzaga. That's just very unfortunate, and not something really within the realm of control for Gonzaga. They can't control what has happened at those two programs since Gonzaga has played them. Regardless, Gonzaga is a top 25 team in the net at 24. They are a top 20 team in the in the KenPom rankings, and yet they are 33rd, according to the AP voters. I did not rank them in my Locked On College Basketball top 25. I came extremely close. I think I put Virginia 25th, Colorado State's in that conversation right at the end of the top 25. San Diego State, who of course beat Gonzaga in that conversation as well. There's a lot of teams that are right in that mix. And Gonzaga's resume doesn't look worse than any of those. It really doesn't. The 1-5 record in quad one still stands out. It still does. But for those who think, well, there's no way Gonzaga should even be close, they're pretty close. They're right in that conversation. As unbiased as I can possibly be when making those top 25s, they are right in that conversation. I'm not surprised to see them picking up the votes, getting some of the momentum that they're getting right now. But when might this happen for the Zags? That's the question. Because this upcoming week doesn't really seem like it's going to move the needle all that much for Gonzaga. They're playing at LMU on Thursday. They're playing at home against Pacific on Saturday. They should win both those games. They should win both those games fairly handily. They struggled with Pacific last time out. They did not struggle with LMU last time out. If they continue to play as well as they have the last couple of weeks, they should beat both these teams. They should beat both these teams by a fairly decent margin. Normally, that wouldn't be enough to move you into the top 25, and it might not be. But it's worth acknowledging that last week, St. Mary's was not ranked in the AP top 25. The next week, this week, they're 18th. All they did last week was go on the road and beat Portland and Pacific. Those are arguably, if not definitively, the two worst teams in the WCC. Portland is competing with Pepperdine and a couple other teams for that second to worst spot behind or ahead of Pacific, I should say. But these two teams are quite bad. St. Mary's went on the road and destroyed both of them, as they should have done, as everybody expected them to do, and they climbed from just outside the top 25 into the top 25 and all the way up to 18. That's a 7-spot climb. If Gonzaga climbs 7 spots, they're 26th. So it is not crazy to think. You can make an argument of whether it should happen, and that's a different conversation, and it's obviously dependent on how those other teams do. If the Mountain West continues to beat each other up and schools like Utah State and Colorado State and San Diego State and New Mexico are having a hard time staying in the top 25 because they keep losing to each other, that could create an opportunity for a school like Gonzaga to jump a fairly considerable amount, like we saw from St. Mary's. But I think it's more likely that Gonzaga makes this move the next week, because after that, well, they got Santa Clara at home after that, and maybe they make the jump there. Santa Clara is a decent enough team that if you blow out if you blow out LMU at home or on the road, you blow out Pacific at home, you blow out San Francisco or Santa Clara, get revenge after losing to them on the road. Maybe that's enough to climb you back in. I could see it happening then. 3 more wins, one of them of the quad 3 variety, 2 of them of the quad 4 variety, or actually 2 of them of the quad 3 variety. LMU on the road is a quad 3. 2 quad 3 wins, 1 quad 4 win, 3-0. Maybe you get there then. But everybody's going to be waiting to see what Gonzaga does in that final week of the regular season when they go on the road to play San Francisco. And yes, it is a road game. This has been officially confirmed. John Rothstein said incorrectly on the broadcast of the game on Saturday against St. Mary's that it was going to be a neutral site game against San Francisco at the Chase Center. I continue to say on this show that I am quite confident that that is actually a road game for the net purposes. And that is correct. It has been confirmed. So that will be a quad 1 opportunity for Gonzaga against San Francisco, assuming they stay in the top 75. They also will have an obvious quad 1 game against St. Mary's on the road in Moraga that Saturday. That's when it matters. Gonzaga goes 2-0, they're in the top 25, almost assuredly. I'd be willing to bet a lot of money on it. If they go 1-1, but they've won every other game, maybe they're in the top 25, maybe. But at that point, we're less concerned about the top 25 and more concerned about, okay, is this resume actually going to get them into the NCAA tournament if they can't beat St. Mary's in Las Vegas? That'll be the bigger concern at that point. But it is possible Gonzaga does find their way back into the top 25 even before that matchup if things go perfectly this week against LMU and Pacific and next week against Santa Clara. If not, it'll probably be the week after that, assuming they can continue this winning streak. Other AP results, Kentucky fell 5 spots from 17 to 22. St. Mary's, we already talked about, jumped all the way up to 18. San Diego State picked up 84 votes, which puts them 29th, just a few spots ahead of Gonzaga. Meanwhile, Washington State, they picked up 82 votes. That puts them 30th, a few spots ahead of Gonzaga as well in that conversation. Really good year so far for the Cougars. They're looking like potentially one of maybe just 2 teams in the Pac-12 to make the NCAA tournament. It could just be Arizona and Washington State, not what people had on their bingo card to start the season, but Pac-12 is going to Pac-12, and even in its final year, it's still going to give us some wonkiness, and this looks like the reality, or at least a potential reality for the Pac-12 in their final year, with Washington State being one of those teams in the big dance. Well, Kelly Olynyk heads back home with his trade to the Toronto Raptors. We're going to talk about that. We also got some conversation about Chet Holmgren. He opened up to Slam Magazine. We're going to talk a little bit about what he said. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 in your pocket if your bet wins. So bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. And I'm just going to continue to say it, the Gonzaga women's team, 24,000 to 1 odds to win the national championship. You guys watch The Office, Kevin Malone says he will take anything that's 10,000 to 1 or better. 24,000 to 1 odds. $5 bet nets you $1,200. If you're like me and you're more than willing to put that money down on Lisa Fortier's team, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, segment 2 here. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And we're going to talk more about Lisa Fortier and that women's team here in the closing segment. But I do want to start here recapping the NBA trade deadline and what it meant for our Zags in the NBA. And it was a very quiet trade deadline. No superstars got moved. No huge, big franchise-altering trades. Zach LaVine is still where he was. Kyle Kuzma is still where he was. DeMar DeRozan still where he was, etc., etc., etc. Also, only one Zag was traded. We weren't super shocked by that. For those of you who listened last week, we did do an episode kind of breaking down the likelihood of any of these Zags getting traded. We talked about Rui Hachimura being a potential salary match for the Los Angeles Lakers. We talked about Corey Kispert potentially getting traded. We talked about Kelly Olynyk potentially getting traded. We didn't really think anybody else was very likely. And in reality, we only just had one of those guys get dealt. That was, of course, Kelly Olynyk. He, alongside Ochai Agbaji, have been dealt to the Toronto Raptors. The Utah Jazz get back Otto Porter Jr., Kira Lewis Jr., and a 2024 first-round pick in return. This is the 6th NBA team for Kelly Olynyk. He has been quite the journeyman the last couple of years, spent a big chunk of his career in Boston to start it off. Then he was in Miami for a couple of years. Then he spent a half year in Houston, spent a little bit of time in Detroit, has spent the last 2-ish years in Utah with the Jazz. This is a big deal for Kelly, the Olynyk family, and frankly, for Canada basketball fans. Kelly's from Kamloops, BC, but he grew up in Toronto. And he's always been a Raptors. He's been affiliated with the Raptors. His mom was a scorekeeper for the Toronto Raptors when he was a kid. She did that for 9 years. His dad worked on the coaching staff at times with the Toronto Raptors as well. Kelly grew up with the Toronto Raptors. He grew up following this team. This was his NBA team. This was Canada's NBA team. And for Kelly to get that opportunity to come back, well, I'll let you listen to what he had to say. I'm going to read a quote from Kelly talking about in his first press conference with the Toronto Raptors. He said, quote, "It's a full circle moment. It's really cool to look back at your life and everything that you've done up till now and how monumental the Raptors have been." So he feels this connection to Toronto, to the city, to the team, to just the area. And now he gets to play for them. Beyond that, Kelly is kind of a icon in Canada basketball. For those of you who don't know, we've talked about this a lot on off-season episodes of Locked On Zags, but Kelly Olynyk is the team captain for the Canadian senior men's national basketball program. When they go to the Olympics in Paris, France in 2024, Kelly Olynyk is not going to only be on Team Canada's roster representing them at the Olympic Games. He's going to be their captain. That is how important to the country of Canada and to all of Canada basketball Kelly Olynyk is. So his return to Toronto is not just, he's getting traded. It's a bit of a salary dump for Utah. They're getting a first-round pick back. He gets to replace some of those front court minutes for Pascal Siakam after his trade. Like, it is all of those things, but it is more than that. It's this opportunity for him to go back home and to play in front of the fans of the country that adores him and that has rooted for him forever. He's the 3rd Canadian to ever play for the Toronto Raptors. This is an incredibly cool thing. Kelly's averaging 8 points, 5 boards, 4.5 assists, shooting about 43% on three. That's all this year with the Utah Jazz. In his first game with Toronto since the trade deadline, he had 11 points and 6 boards. He also tacked on 3 assists and 3 steals in 22 minutes. Really nice to see him play well in that first game with Toronto. I think he's going to have a really good second half of the year here as he's re-energized and reinvigorated, getting a chance to play in his home country. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of other trades that really made a big impact across the NBA landscape, but really not any that impacted the Zags. The Pacers made a couple of trades, but nothing that's going to impact Andrew Nembhard's playing time. The Wizards made a couple trades, but nothing that really is going to impact Corey Kispert. The Lakers acquired some talent, but it shouldn't impact Rui Hachimura's minutes. There just wasn't a lot that really happened. There was one trade. The Oklahoma City Thunder traded Davis Bertans and a handful of other players and a handful of picks in order to acquire Gordon Hayward. Gordon Hayward's not going to play the same position as Chet Holmgren. He just adds a little bit of firepower, a little bit of star power to that Oklahoma City roster. Davis Bertans was one of the backup bigs for Chet Holmgren, but it's not really going to impact Chet's role, Chet's impact for this Oklahoma City team. It just makes Oklahoma City better, and they were already pretty darn good coming into this trade deadline. So it'll be good to see them continue to be even better and potentially compete to finish at the top of the Western Conference and really push for a potential NBA championship. Speaking of Chet Holmgren, he was the Slam magazine cover athlete for this week. And Slam magazine has not been in the media for a long time. It was a kind of a really popular early 2000s magazine that talked about basketball, but they are still a journalistic company. And they did this big interview with Chet Holmgren. They had him on the cover. I read the article. I'm going to link to it in the show notes. It's very interesting. Chet talks at length about what, kind of where he was at when he learned about the injury, the conversations he had when he first suffered the foot injury, his work through rehab, everything, like being on this team now, being with, his teammates that he has, getting to help lead this team back into the playoffs. Like he covered a whole bunch of different topics, and it was really a fascinating read. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. I do have one quote that I wanted to read where it was him talking about like what he was doing during his rehab. And there was a lot of pictures that many of you probably saw of Chet Holmgren with his bad foot up on a scooter with his knee up like that. And he was taking jump shots off of just one leg. And he talked a little bit about that. And I'm just going to read the direct quote here. He says, "I was out there on the court, standing on one leg with the other leg up on a scooter, just shooting as many shots as I could before they made me go sit down. They'd be telling me, like, go home. But when you're just standing on a scooter, you're not getting tired. So I was like, I can do this all day." Love that from Chet. Love the energy, the passion that we've always seen from Chet, of course. Missing that first year was a big fuel to the fire for those people out there who thought, oh, he's injury prone. He's not going to live up to the potential. He's too skinny, whatever. All the complaints that people had about Chet Holmgren very clearly have looked silly as he has put together a rookie of the year caliber campaign. He is, of course, competing next to another very tall and skinny player in Victor Wembanyama for the San Antonio Spurs. Chet has been the better player. He's the more efficient player. Victor has bigger numbers. Be interesting to see how that race shakes out. I'm sure Chet would love to win the award. Who wouldn't? But he's more focused on leading his team into the NBA playoffs, where they are a much, much better spot than the San Antonio Spurs, to the point where it's actually what is hurting Chet Holmgren's Rookie of the Year campaign. People are like, oh, he's got better teammates around him, so of course he's more efficient. I suppose that's a fair argument, but I don't think it's fair to punish Chet Holmgren for that. He doesn't control that. Regardless, as we get closer to the end of the NBA season, we'll have more conversations about Chet's Rookie of the Year campaign, where he's at in that conversation, whether he could truly be the guy to take home that award or not. But always love reading about Chet, always love reading quotes from Chet. He's just a really good kid and works really hard. And I think it's been so validating to see him have this success in his first NBA season, and seeing an article like this that talks about the amount of work that he put in to get back into this position just makes it feel even sweeter that we're getting to witness it as Gonzaga fans. Well, Yvonne Ejim played for Team Canada last week, not with the Gonzaga Bulldogs. We're going to discuss how she did and how the women's team did just fine without her. All that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy. And it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, LED headlights, exhaust kits, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll find exactly what you are looking for. Plus, with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices that you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, closing out the show today, talking about the Gonzaga women's basketball program. They climbed up to number 17 in the AP poll after another 2-0 week in the WCC. They were 19th last week, steadily moving up. I think they've peaked at 15, but they've kind of stayed right outside the top 15 despite just obliterating every single team that they have played last week. Again, without Yvonne Ejim, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but without her on the floor, they beat Pepperdine by 37 points. They followed that up with a 24-point victory over LMU. Against Pepperdine, they shot 10 of 24. It's about 42% from three. Kaylin Trung had 19 points on 5 of 7 shooting from beyond the arc. Against LMU, they held LMU to 6 points in the first quarter. 6 points. It wasn't a particularly good offensive night from Gonzaga, less so than we've seen. They only had 71 points. But when you hold the opposing team to 6 points in the first quarter, you kind of pretty quickly establish that this isn't a game that's going to be competitive, and that ended up being the case. Kaylin continued a fantastic week. She had 13 points and 8 assists in that one. The Lady Zags are now 24-2 on the year. They've lost the very beginning of the season to Washington State. They lost to Louisville later in the non-conference slate. That's it. 11-0 on the WCC. Obviously, the big win over Stanford, wins over Cal and Arizona and Rice and South Dakota State, New Mexico, a handful of other teams in the non-conference slate. Their closest WCC game remains an 18-point victory. That is the closest game they have played in conference play. 9 of their 11 wins have been by 20 or more points. 4 of their 11 wins have been by 35 or more points. It is impossible to understate the dominance that has been the Gonzaga women's basketball team in the West Coast Conference in the 2023-24 season. And yet the Zags fell from 10 to 13 in the net. It's a bummer. The net is a computer system. It's not evaluating things the same way, so it's not biased necessarily. I've been a little critical of the AP voters for not giving Gonzaga the flowers that I think they deserve, but the net is not necessarily doing that. It's just the WCC is weak. And so even a 24-point victory over a bad team just doesn't help you as much as you'd think that it might. For the rest of the conference, Santa Clara has moved up. They're still only 78th in the net. That's the second best team in the WCC, and they're outside the top 75. Portland's 96th. Those are the only 2 teams in the top 150 as Pacific comes in at 157th. They're one of 2 opponents the Gonzaga Bulldogs are going to face this week. They're at St. Mary's and at Pacific, pair of road games. Last time they played St. Mary's, they beat them by 29 points. But that's not even close to the biggest margin of victory against these 2 teams, as Gonzaga also played Pacific at home earlier this year, and they beat them by 65 points. That was the game where they scored. The Pacific was held to 39 points. Gonzaga topped 40 with 5 minutes left in the second quarter. That was when Gonzaga hit their technical game-winning basket, as Pacific never managed to even top that total. And not only do they get to play these 2 teams that they've beat by 29 and 65 points, they get to do it with Yvonne Ejim. Yvonne missed both games last week because she was with Team Canada. Team Canada was playing in a qualifying tournament in order to get into the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris, France. There was a 3-game series. They were playing against Hungary, Spain, and Japan. The top 3 teams out of those 4 advance into the Olympic Games in Paris. Canada came really close to not being among those top teams. They won their first game against Hungary. Then they lost their second game to Spain. That set them up for a matchup against Japan in the 3rd game. If they beat Japan, clear. They're in, no debate, no question. But they lost 86-82, got upset by Japan, and then had to wait and watch as Spain upset Hungary. If that had not happened, Canada would not be in the Olympic Games. Fortunately for them, Spain, who had already clinched a spot, still beat Hungary and still put them out of the Olympic picture while allowing the Canadian team to end up being in the Olympics. Yvonne didn't do much. This is not a surprise to us. There are very few college athletes who represent their country on the national team, the senior national team, not the junior team, not the FIBA, like the actual national team. Yvonne is on that team. The most of the players around her are professionals. They're either WNBA players, they're playing overseas, they are professional athletes. Yvonne played 8 minutes in the 3 total game, or in 3 of the games. She didn't play in one of them. She had 1 steal and 1 foul. That was it. Took a couple of shots, missed them, that's it. She is not yet a foundational piece the way that Kelly Olynyk is for Team Canada on the men's side. Kelly Olynyk has also been a professional basketball player for over a decade. Yvonne is still a college player. The odds of her eventually being a foundational piece for Team Canada are extremely high because she's already getting this experience as a college student. It is very rare. Zach Edey is on the back of the bench for Team Canada. I'm not sure as of this recording if he's even going to be on the team that goes to Paris in the 2024 Olympic Games. Zach Edey is a 2-time National Player of the Year, the best college basketball player in the country for 2 straight years. That's not saying that that's the direct comparison to Yvonne Ejim, but just pointing out the rarity of being a college student and being on your senior national team for countries like Canada. For smaller countries, it's a little bit less rare, I should say, but it is not that common here. This is an incredible testament to how good Yvonne Ejim is, how hard she has worked, how much she has grown and developed as a player under Lisa Fortier these last couple of years. Because now she has put herself in a position to be a big piece for Canada's Olympic hopes for maybe not a big piece this year, but by 2028, probably, maybe even 2032, depending on how her career goes. This is a huge step for her. And the fact that Gonzaga didn't even register that she didn't play, in the sense that they still secured 2 20-plus point victories over teams in the conference. Like they didn't even need her to win those games. Just a testament to the absolutely ridiculously loaded, deep, experienced, talented team that Coach Lisa Fortier has put together this year. They got a couple more games until we get into that WCC tournament picture in a couple weeks. Very excited to see if this team can remain undefeated through there, what that might look like for their future when we get into Selection Monday on the women's side, and where that might land them in the NCAA tournament. We'll have more coverage about this team. We'll have more coverage about the Zags and the NBA. And of course, we'll be getting you ready for Gonzaga's game against LMU on Thursday on the road. Another matchup against Dominic Harris, what that means for the Zags. We'll got some WCC stuff coming your way on Wednesday's episode as well, all right here on the Locked On Zags podcast. I want to thank all of you for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out to those everyday listeners, and shout out to those of you in the Discord channel. Join if you have not done so yet. It is free, and there's a link in the show notes on both audio and video platforms. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.